Welcome to the DIY Wealth Canada podcast, a show by independent investors for independent investors. Join hosts Bob and Nelson as they discuss investing, personal finance, and much more, all from a fiercely self-reliant Canadian perspective. As a reminder, nothing you're about to hear is investment advice. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the DIY Wealth Canada podcast. I'm Nelson here as always with Bob. And today we have a special episode for you. I think this one's going to be a bit of a popular one because we're going to talk about something that will probably get some clicks and get a little bit of controversy. And so I'm kind of like looking forward to that. Bob, before we start and before we kind of reveal the topic here, anything you want to say before we kind of get going?
Yeah, you just mentioned it to me. We had a quick chat maybe for a couple of minutes before recording, and we were going through some of the podcast ideas. And Nelson, you say, hey, I got a really good one. And you just kind of dropped it on me, and I was pretty shocked, but you didn't get into details. So I'm very interested to find out what's going on. So yeah, go ahead and reveal what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I wanted to wait to reveal the details so we could get Bob's reaction live, not really live, I guess, but because it's recorded, but so he gets to hear it as kind of like the same time you guys hear it. And the topic of today is going to be failed early retirements. And we're going to talk about my failed early retirement because I officially have a job again.
Okay, when I heard it a few minutes ago, that was a complete shock to me because I thought you're good, you're early retired, and I mean, you know, you're still generating some money through your writing and stuff, but I wasn't expecting you to get a job. So let's find out what happened, what's going on.
So there were kind of a few different things that were going through my head that sort of made me go back to the dark side, if you will. So number one is that my wife has a job. She's a teacher. I won't talk, too much about her career or anything because she really dislikes when I talk about her on the podcast, but she has a career. She's good at it and she wants to keep doing it. And as she was working and she was, doing things to further her career and she would come home and talk about her day. And I kind of realized that I really didn't have much to say when she asked me about my day. It was, what did you do today? Well, I wrote about this stock. Or more and more often, it was, I argued with someone on Twitter or, in the comment section or whatever. So there was kind of just this professional, like she had this kind of, professional role that was helping her mental health and was kind of, she was doing well at it. And I could see that was valuable for her. And I didn't have that. And that was, kind of the first factor where it was like, man, it was almost like I was wasting my potential to just kind of, do this sort of part-time newsletter and then kind of have a life of leisure on top of that.
Oh, that's interesting. I could kind of see why you would think that way. So what kind of job field did you end up going to? Are you going back to working full-time or are you just doing part-time or what's going on there?
Yeah, so I am working full-time again and I'm back in the grocery business where I have a lot of kind of relevant experience. But for me, it was more like I wanted to be back in the store. I wanted to, kind of have that interaction with the people I work with and with customers and just kind of that reason to leave the house and kind of have that something to work towards. Because ultimately, the biggest reason why I was a failed early retiree was not because the, professional thing. It wasn't, everyone's going to, oh, Nelson ran out of money and I didn't run out of money. Like my portfolio's done quite well since I, left the workforce. It was I was at home all day by myself, hanging out with my cat, and I was lonely. Like, there is only so much that you can do when all of your friends have jobs and they have kids and they have all the obligations. Don't. You have all this time to fill up,
So
and
for you,
you're just kind of seeing people, just like the scraps of that. So sorry, go ahead.
yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting, right? So you're not going back to working full time because you're running out of money. Is more on the other side is more the social aspect. Like via my blog, I certainly have heard or talked to or met a few early retirees just like you, and some have gone back to working full time, or even a few went back to working full time. I'll just talk about the full time folks, and most of them went back to working full time for mostly, like I would say, mostly because they wanted to have a little bit more buffer. Because when these people, they look at their spreadsheets, their projections, and all these people I know, they have kids, and when they start looking at kids' expenses and post-secondary education, they started to not freak out, but more a little bit concerned about the how much post-secondary education would cost. So many of these people that retired early and went back to work full time, they just wanted to have a little bit more buffer, right? And I actually know a few where they come back to work multiple times. For example, they were like very high level before they went into early retirement. They come back. They took a more junior position just to have a little bit more income, and then kind of building up that buffer. And what I learned from talking to these people is that the companies they were working at would try to force them to get more responsibilities, et cetera, because they were very experienced. So them taking on a junior job was not really suitable. So they were getting really pushed to go up the corporate ladder. And because they already have enough money, despite they wanted to build a bit more buffer, they didn't want that added pressure. So they end up, quitting after a few years or even few months, and then take a break and then go back to work, kind of thing. So I know a few people that done that repeatedly, but it's interesting to hear that you're on the other side. Money isn't a concern; it's more the social aspect, the call it working with people, and finding stuff to do with your time. So that's very interesting. One question I have is, because you were retired for a few years, did you find it hard to get back, like especially during the interview process? Did they ask you like, why was there a big gap in your resume, for example, or that wasn't a concern?
If anything, it was easier than ever, because when I went to the interview, so I applied at one place and I got hired at that place. And it was I did my research beforehand when I kind of, it was sort of mid last year that I was thinking of, sort of getting a job again. I had these trips booked. And so I was kind of like, I'll put it off until like this trip, and I'll put it off until this trip, and so on. And so kind of, it just sort of, this feeling just kind of grew and grew until I realized that it was right for me. But what happened when I went to the interview, there was no nervousness, there was no stress, there was no nothing, because I knew that, if I didn't get the job, it was going to be just fine. I wasn't going to starve. I was really focused on finding a fit that was good for me, and I was willing to be patient if I needed to. But I wasn't, I went in, I, kind of explained in the interview a little bit about my situation, not entirely. It was mostly just, hey, I took a break from working. I'm ready to come back now. And that was really all I said. And it was not an issue at all. It was like you said, Bob, in terms of talking about these other early retirees, is that people saw my experience in the industry and said, hey, we want this guy around. And so we very quickly made a deal, and I'm back to work.
Cool. That's first of all, congratulations, I guess. I'm not sure if that's the right word to say it. So walk me through the reason for full-time versus part-time, or you just wanting to get more social interaction with different people, hence for just jumping right into the full-time position?
Yeah, I figured that professionally I would be more inclined to work full time. In grocery, there are definitely part-time opportunities, but they're mostly entry level. And I knew that if I went in entry level, I would get bored very quickly because there's just no challenge for me at that point. I think about 15 years of experience in the grocery business. The entry level stuff is just too easy for me. And I knew that I would, after a few months, just get bored and have to stop doing that. So it is more kind of like, middle, it's not executive. I don't know if anyone would hire me as an executive, to be honest. It's more kind of like middle level, middle management type of thing. And I figured that was sort of this good balance between getting a challenge but also, kind of primarily doing it for the social aspect. It's not just a social aspect. A lot of it is like just that kind of struggle of working with people together towards a common goal. One thing that I struggled with running the newsletter, we can talk about the kind of the future of the newsletter in a minute, but one of the things I struggled with was that you go up against a lot of other different newsletters, and you can either sort of work together like, you and I do, and like, us and like Mark C do, and a lot of the other sort of good Canadian creators that are out there that sort of talk about the same thing. I think we do a really nice job of supporting each other. Or you can look at, some of the other people who just really want to kind of point out why their competition is wrong or stupid or et cetera. And so that loneliness of running a solo business on my own without having someone else there to support me, that was tough. And that was a part of the motivation as well.
That makes sense. So you talked about the newsletter. So tell me, what's your plan for your newsletter moving forward once you get back to full-time work?
So the plan, when I accepted the job, I immediately let current premium subscribers know that there wasn't going to be a fee to renew. We were just going to sort of run off the paid part of the newsletter. And then once everybody sort of gets their money's worth in terms of their subscription, then it's going to pivot into a free versus or like a freemium maybe model where there may be some ads put on to kind of cover my costs, but it's just not going to be a for-profit venture anymore. It's just going to be kind of a hobby, something to do for me to sort of share what I'm doing with the portfolio and kind of get some feedback from people on that, or hopefully to just kind of help some people make their own decisions on that. Because ultimately that was always the goal of the newsletter, was to kind of help people increase their dividend income, to find good dividend paying stocks that may be sort of under the radar, and just so they could be more successful investors. And I mean, I can continue to do that without charging. In fact, you could easily argue that, sort of once everything is more opened up, then I can help more people with that. And I don't have to worry about finfluencer rules or anything like that, because you do have to worry about it a little bit, but at the end of the day, regulators pay more attention to people that charge versus people that are doing it for free.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting approach, and I think it makes a lot of sense for your situation to going back to work. I definitely understand the working with other people toward the same goal, and build up a team, working in a team environment type of thing. And yeah, I think when you're in your 40s and your friends are still working and they have obligations and all that stuff, yeah, it's tough during the day to find stuff to do. And that's something my wife and I have been talking about for a while. We're definitely working towards eventually quitting my full-time employment and we've been talking about it for a few years, and my wife is like, well, what are you going to do once you stop working? I was like, well, I'll figure it out. But that's not the right answer, right? So she's always like, well, go find some hobby, some interest to do, and get yourself involved. So I'm involved in my kids scouting. I'm a volunteer scouter, but that's only during the evening, right? Like once a week. I guess this year I'm one of the co-commissioners or responsible for the entire group. So I've taken on more responsibilities, but again, that's not a full-time job, right? And then that's kind of the reason why I mentioned about it on my blog. I got into curling, and like join a few teams and play some 2 to 3 nights a week, sometimes more. And again, that's only in the evening, at least currently. But through that, there's a bunch of social aspect. And unfortunately, the curling club I'm in during the day they call it the Senators League. So it's people that's over 55 could play. So I was talking to my wife the other day. I'm kind of half jokingly said, oh, even if I retire now, I can't join these leagues because I'm still too young. So we had a good laugh about it. But yeah, I totally get where you're coming from, Nelson. That's something I'm really spending a lot of time thinking, like, what's my next step if I do end up deciding to quit full-time employment in the next, I think on my blog, I said sometime before 2030. So that's, including the 5 years, but it could be earlier. And like, what am I going to do during the day? Right? Like that's definitely a very good question. So maybe for working part-time, it's an option. It's a little bit hard working in high tech part-time because you're just getting pulled, all over the place, working around the clock kind of thing. So I don't know. It's definitely something I've thought about it. But yeah, that's very interesting that you have decided to go back to full-time employment, not for the money aspect, but for the other aspects. So that's very interesting for sure.
One thing when I was kind of a fresh early retiree, because the point you brought up, Bob, about the curling club and kind of what are you going to do during the day, this was something that I thought about, and I thought that I had an answer. I was going to research stocks, I was going to write about stocks, I was going to golf in the summer, I was going to travel, I had all these plans. I was going to hang out with friends, and I found what was happening was that I always got to the point where I was a little bit like annoying when it came to wanting to, spend time with my friends. And there was one friend who, I was kind of almost like every week I was bugging her, like, hey, let's go for lunch. Like that's, and she kept kind of making excuses for why she couldn't go. And I was a little bit like, sort of, wow, a little bit upset about it. And then I realized, Nelson, you got to realize that these people are not in the same stage of life as you, and they have work obligations, they have family obligations, and there's just, there might not, whether there's time or there's not time, there's that factor of, they feel guilty kind of taking the time out to do something like that when, they kind of have responsibilities at home that aren't being done with. And two is, I think that from the, their shoes in terms of your friends and who aren't early retired, where you show up and you're like, hey, like, I don't have to work anymore, so I have all the time in the world. There may be some resentment when it comes down to that. And people are nice and they, never said it to my face or anything. But, looking back on it in hindsight, I can see why that would have been annoying for people. So that's just another factor that kind of, factors into all this. And so ultimately what I found was that I spent way less time with friends than what I anticipated or that I wanted to, because they just weren't in the same boat as me. So that's something to consider as well. And I'll say that, the piece of advice that I got kind of over and over again was to volunteer and to find something that I could sort of dedicate my time to. And there was not a whole lot that I could find that I really wanted to sink my teeth into when it came to volunteer opportunities in terms of, like areas where I thought I could help and thought that I had something to contribute. And, like I could have volunteered for something that would have basically just entailed me having a job. And so at that point, it's like, well, if I'm going to do that, I might as well just get a job. So that was something else that kind of factored into the decision, was that it's not easy to find things to pass the time. It was a lot harder than what I anticipated. And I think that's, getting away from the finance aspect of it. I think just kind of life in general is people are more secluded. They don't go out as much anymore. There's not that effort that there used to be. It's just sort of, we all kind of stay at home at night and hang out on our phones.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I'm just thinking about my cousin. For those listeners that don't know, one of my cousins, he retired in his early 40s. He and his wife lives in Taiwan, and they got kids. So I actually talked to him quite a bit about this on this particular topic. He's like, what do you do during the day? Because his wife also works, and he retired early, as mentioned. And for him, he just became a house dad, right? So he would take the kids to school, pick them up, make dinner, and then he ended up doing a lot of biking and badminton, got really into sports for a while, and then his son decided to play clarinet, so he then picked up clarinet and was playing with his son. So from that aspect, he was finding stuff to do. But yeah, I think he also mentioned that it's hard to find people within the same age group as him during the day because a lot of people are still working, right? So that was definitely a struggle for him. I think that's a common point for a lot of early retirees, and you kind of have to find so-called meaning in your new chapter of life. And some are easier for some people, sometimes harder for some people. Yeah, I think it also depends on, maybe a little bit depends on the city you're living in. Like if you're living in a small town, it'll be a lot tougher than if you were to live in a big city. Maybe you'll run into more early retirees in bigger cities. I don't know, hard to say, right? So there are a lot of different factors, and also you talk about traveling, and you I don't know. I think you can only travel for so long. Like constantly only run isn't, not only run, but like constantly traveling could get old pretty quickly, right? So you kind of have to find that balance for yourself and your family. But yeah, like what you said and what I said, that's definitely a topic I've been thinking a lot, and I've written a number of posts on my blog about it. And yeah, unfortunately, you will never get the right answer, and you really don't know until you step your toes and take the lead per se, right? So what's your plan in terms of full-time employment? Just kind of go year by year and see what happens, or do you have a new early retirement day again, or
No, I don't have a new early retirement day. I am just going to do it until I stop enjoying it, and then at that point make a decision of whether I want to do something else or whether I want to go back to early retirement or whatever. A lot of that will depend on what my wife decides to do with her career, because ultimately, Bobby talked about travel, and I travel a lot. Like I went to a bunch of places, and I went, sometimes with my wife and sometimes with friends, and a lot of the time by myself, because it was just, I knew that I would have no one else to travel with, and my wife was working, so I'd need to kind of do it by myself if I wanted to do it. And I never minded traveling alone. In fact, there's a lot of times where I preferred it, because like I don't mind, my own company or anything, like I think it was just combined with spending so much time alone, kind of when I was at home, and then doing some traveling alone. And it just came down to just spending a lot of time alone. And I'm an introvert. I don't hate spending time by myself, but it just got to be too much. I'll touch on the kids thing because I think that's a really interesting perspective from your cousin. I think it's easier to be an early retiree if you have kids. Your kids keep you busy. You can, but you talk about the clarinet, like that's a great hobby for anybody to take up at any age. And maybe I should have taken that up because I do not play any instruments, but I think that's a important thing to, that is something that will keep you busy. But ultimately I don't have any kids and we don't have any plans to have kids. So that part was kind of missing in my life that maybe it would have been easier if we would have had kids. I did take on some of the house husband responsibilities. I made dinner, I did some of the other things. I took care of, certain things around the house that sort of needed to be taken care of. But at the same time, it's like, I'm still going to do a lot of that working because it's like full-time job is not the end of the world in terms of, I still find that I'm going to have a decent amount of time on my hands to make sure that stuff gets done. Because, Bob, you work full time and you help around the house, presumably, maybe you can fudge the truth here a little bit if your wife's listening. But yeah, so I think that a lot of the hobbies that I was doing as an early retiree, I'm still going to have time to do them, especially as a guy without kids.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different when you don't have the kids. But I think it's also nice. I just want to talk about the fact you're going back to working full time, and you touched a little bit on this is the fact that you don't need the money. So there's that freedom aspect where you're not relying on the paycheck anymore, and if you could just do what you need to do to earn the income, and if you don't have the income, so be it, right? So there's that. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is job security doesn't really matter to you. So that's very liberating. Certainly, when you're always constantly afraid of you might get let go, and the fact that you need to rely on the paychecks, that's a different mentality, right? So that mentality shift is extremely powerful, and that's something I have experienced a little bit for myself with my full-time job. Because there's been, like, I work in high tech, we have gone through 10%, 20% workforce cuts over, I don't know, I've been there for 19 years. So I've seen that this kind of cuts quite often, every other years almost, or sometimes every year, when the economy isn't doing too well. And looking back, there were times where I could have been on the chopping block, but I wasn't. And even now, like, because we're at a point where we could call it for early retirement. So for me, it's like, again, that psychology, that mental shift is very powerful because I'm like, well, if they cut me, so be it. That's my time. I don't have any control over it. And if they cut me, okay, fine, I'll get a severance package, and maybe that'll force me into early retirement, or I'll find some other opportunities. Like, there's not much I could worry about it. So why worry about it, right? Like, it's outside my control. So from that aspect, having enough or having your portfolio already generating a sufficient amount of money so you could live off from it is very, very powerful, regardless whether you're still working or not. So yeah, so I think good for you, really, looking into deep and trying to figure out what's going on, and then ultimately finding that going back to work full time is the solution. So no shame about that, and it's totally normal for some early retirees to go back to work. I've seen examples of that. So yeah, I think that's very interesting that you're going down this route, and I could kind of see it a little bit because obviously knowing you and your wife don't have kids, you're certainly not into the driving kids around type of situation. So you maybe have a little bit more time on your hand. Need to find stuff to fill out that time.
Yeah, I really find that my schedule is going to mesh a lot better with other people's schedules. And, I think that's going to, like, I'm anticipating spending about an equal amount of time with friends and family or whatever as I did as an early retiree. but it's going to feel a lot more satisfying because of, it's like when you have an unlimited amount of something, it kind of loses its luster. And for me, it was kind of this unlimited amount of free time, and that after a while, free time just kind of loses its luster. At least it did with me. But what I want to talk about, Bob, is your point about how, the kind of having that ability to, like once you've reached financial independence or you're really close, and in terms of working, you kind of get that freedom of when it's time for the rounds of layoffs or it's time for someone to get cut or whatever. You really don't care as much before, because it's like, hey, worst case scenario, I get cut. Oh, well, like it's not going to impact my life financially a whole lot. So I think that is a really powerful feeling. And I think that feeling has a few different advantages, not just that kind of, knowing that things are going to be okay. I think it makes it a lot easier to have kind of more healthy boundaries when it comes to work. It makes it easier to kind of say no to overtime or to a lot of the extra work that we find that kind of pins us down in sort of these corporate settings. You know how it is. It's just like, it seems like the work just always expands, and there's always this kind of, sort of busy work that we do because somebody decides it needs to get done. And for me, I'm really anticipating it just being a lot easier to say, hey, like this is my schedule, and that's just what it's going to be. There's not going to be a whole lot of working extra. There's not going to be a whole lot of like taking my job home with me. It's just, I think it's a lot easier to kind of turn off that little bit of extra ambition that is good in a lot of ways, but is also bad when it becomes this sort of all-consuming thing. Like we all know people who their job is everything because they're just chasing that next promotion or whatever. And for me, the kind of experiment is going to be, how much more fulfilled am I at a job if I don't have this, that in the back of my mind all the time. So that's going to be interesting for me to see, but I'm anticipating that it's going to be more positive for me, especially as somebody who, one of my weaknesses back when I, did take my career seriously was that, like I cared probably too much.
Yeah, and I think just kind of looking at myself, I would say now I'm where I am in terms of investment portfolio. When it comes to work, I would say I'm not afraid to speak up a little bit more, knowing that, not that I don't care, but I feel like I could speak up a little bit more, even in like important meetings with higher ups and stuff. And that somehow has made me, it's kind of funny to say this, make me a better employee in some ways, because I'm not afraid to speak up when things are like messed up, right? So that's kind of ironic in some way, and then I find myself better at manage my time, because with high tech you get stuck into a lot of meetings and such, and sometimes I wonder, like, am I adding value to these meetings? And therefore, if I believe I'm not adding value to these meetings, I turn them down or just don't show up. And I guess it helps when your manager could back you up. But because what I've been doing in terms of turning down these meetings, or just say, hey, like, do I really need to attend? I would literally ask the organizer, like, do you actually need me? Because I don't think I would add any value to the meeting. Or I would say, hey, I don't think you need me. Send me the meeting summaries, and then if you need me, let me know. I could help, right? So instead of spending 30 minutes, an hour in these meetings, I'm doing something else, and then I would get a summary. Or sometimes, with AI, you could get AI to generate meeting summaries. So I free up 30 minutes, an hour of my time to do something else, and as a result, I find myself way more efficient in some way. So it's a little bit ironic in that sense, where when you have the freedom because you have enough, you end up being a better employee. So that's an interesting way to think about it. If that make any sense to you at all.
I think it makes a ton of sense, and I'm fully expecting to go into this as someone who's kind of the same way, where it's like for me it was my previous job before I retired was very time like it their expectation was that I worked more than 40 hours a week, and I did it until I kind of burned out and stopped doing it. And like I realize now that probably would have been more beneficial to my mental health if I would have taken that kind of attitude, or if I would have just hey, I mean, I was financially independent at that point, and yet I was acting like someone who wasn't. And looking back on it, it's like, well, that made no sense at all. What's the point of working hard and sacrificing and, saving whatever percent of my income for 20 years, 25 years that I'd been working at that point to just kind of, deal with the same crap as everybody else and not push back. So if anything, I learned that, and like you said, Bob, you're a better employee for doing that. And I believe that I would have been a better employee for doing that as well, just to, kind of push back and hopefully change things a little bit for the better, even if it was just for, me selfishly. So absolutely. I think that the, knowing that I'm FI without having to, if the worst case scenario happens, it's not going to be a big deal. And I think that will help me mentally. And I think it'll be good for the organization too, because I will be able to talk without a filter and things like that.
Yeah, I think ultimately just, I don't know, I think you just don't put that with all the BS and, politics at work as much. And again, it's not like your care meter is not running 100%, but just you would find what's important to you, and you zone in and focus on that rather than all the stuff that's happening around, right? So at least that's for me, anyways. So yeah, it would be very interesting to hear how this new chapter, or going back to your old chapter of life, does. I think we should do an update like 6 months or something from now and see how that works out, and if the way you see work has changed now you are going back to work.
Yeah, I mean, we will set a reminder in our calendars and absolutely do that, because I'm actually curious myself to kind of see how, I'll listen to this episode, and then, we'll kind of do the follow-up at that time. And, what I'm really hoping for is that, we, my care meter, if my care meter could run at about 80%, I think I'd be happy with that. I think it's kind of a good long-term place for me to be, because, before I cared too much, and I took too much of it home, and kind of affected my mental health a little bit. So it's going to be a test for me to be able to, see if I can kind of ratchet back that care meter. I think I will be able to, but at the same time, if you would have asked me 3 years ago if I would have failed as a early retiree, I probably would have said, no, I'm not going to, no, I think I'm good. I've, I thought about this, and I probably put more thought process into my early retirement that most people do when it comes to retirement in general. Of course, a lot of people just have to retire because they're forced to. But, I really thought that I thought this over. And in hindsight, I've realized that, what I thought early retirement was going to be and what early retirement was just different enough that I didn't particularly enjoy it that much.
Yeah, and I think the nice thing is you have the option. Right? You have the option to either continue to retire and pursue other stuff, or you have the option to go back to work. And that's the power of FI. Let's not talk about the RE part, but FIRE is kind of broken into two parts, right? Financial independence and retire early. And unfortunately, a lot of people see the two combined together, but sometimes it's you just want to hit FI and just to give you more options in life, whether you continue to work or not, or you switch from full-time to part-time, or as Mark C calls it, work optional, right? Or
work on own terms.
On your own term. Work optional as well. Tanya Hester, that's an American writer who I know. Her first book was called Work Optional. But yeah, basically just do stuff that you want to do, and in some way that's exactly what you're doing, Nelson. Right? You decide to go back to work because you decide that that's a good idea for you, and not because of the money. It's because something else. So no, I think kudos to you, and that's definitely very interesting news. I wasn't expecting that at all when we talked earlier. So yeah, I think we're just about time to wrap up here. Any last word for listeners, Nelson?
I can just imagine what the comment section is going to look like after this, and by all means, fire away. You can go ahead and tell me how bad this is, and that's fine, because, like, one of the things I've learned is that when it comes to people agreeing with you online, disagreeing with you online, none of that matters. What matters is, are you doing what's best for yourself, and are you doing what's best for your family? And, whether this is best or not, we'll see. But that's just all you can do, and let the critics be damned.
Yeah, for sure. No, again, we should do a update in 6 months or so to rediscuss this topic. But yeah, I think that's all the time we have for today. So as usual, thanks, Nelson, for talking to me on some of these interesting topics. Today was quite interesting, and yeah, we'll talk again next time.
Thanks, Bob. Always a pleasure to chat, and the next one might not be as exciting as this one.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you subscribe to never miss another episode. For more from Bob, visit his site at tawcan.com. That's TAWCAN, all one word. Nelson can be found at CanadianDividendInvesting.com. They're both on Twitter as well. Just search for Tawcan or CDI Newsletter. Thanks. See you next time.